All right, hello. We're going to go ahead and get started. So let me explain a few things going on tonight that are different. I am live streaming to those who are online from right up here. So we've got a few people coming in because we've had this issue with the green line and other things going on our screen on the live stream. So I'm just going to do the live stream part from up here. So that's, just ignore all this. I figure Sunday night you can still see me okay. This is what how I usually set it up when I'm recording for our Wednesday night series. So hopefully this will come out clear for those of you who are joining us online. So welcome. There is a note sheet for tonight. It is the same as last week, but if you missed last week or need a new one, is that the last one maybe? Or we have... Okay, everyone may already have one. I'm not sure. Does anyone need one? Okay, we do need a couple more. Okay. And then I also have the complete packet of notes for the whole series. If you are missing a number of pages, you can just pick up a complete packet up here at the front afterwards. So a couple other announcements. This is going to be the finale for our spiritual warfare series tonight. So we're going to, you know this, there's just one half of a page. The back page from last week is all we have left to cover, so I'm going to finish this tonight. I want to talk a little bit later with those of you who are here in person about anything you watched during the week or your homework assignment from last week. We'll talk more about that, and you can have questions about what we go over tonight. So next week, I am not planning on us having a class. We'll take a break for a couple weeks. The following week is Mother's Day. I'm not sure about the 16th yet. I'm planning on a training meeting with just greeters, and that could be either after a class or we may start classes again on the 23rd. I'm thinking about doing a topical series on apologetics over the summer. I'd like to get into a full course on apologetics. But I don't know if summer is the best time to do that. I may hold off until the fall. So what I may do is do just sort of a different, some of the main topics that come up in apologetics, different one each week for a few weeks for our summer series. That's kind of where I'm leaning right now. But just stay tuned. I'll let you know when we're getting ready to start that up. So tonight we are in our last section. Let me begin by reading the scripture verse that we started off with. I want to kind of try to tie some of these themes we've looked at together. So our scripture verse is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 and 12. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What we've looked at in this time is we've identified more about who these rulers and authorities are, Satan, these other angelic beings that are allied with him, some of the distinctions between demons and rulers and authorities. Then we've looked at some evidence, external evidence, ghosts, aliens, psychics in particular, that confirm that the kind of things that we see happening in the world that people experience are best explained by the biblical understanding of these supernatural beings at work around us. And then we've looked at what it is that they want. Well, what they wanted initially was to sort of prove that we were some kind of mistake, that God was incorrect or wrong to make us, that they wanted to challenge God's wisdom in making us. Well, that was defeated at the cross. That aspect of their plan has been completely put to an end. They know that their time is short, that they are defeated. So now their main objective is to deceive. And so when we talk about putting on the full armor of God to take our stand against the devil's schemes, we are talking about looking for deception in the world around us that leads people away from God's truth, whether that be an alternative story that may be attractive, that blocks people from being open-minded towards the gospel, or questions and attacks that are raised against the gospel itself. There are going to be all kinds of forms in which deception comes. So our objective is to recognize that deception, for us to know truth, and then for us to be on the offense against that deception. So we've looked at a few ways to do that. One of the ways we talked about last week is even just how we consume popular culture, how we watch movies, because movies can be a very powerful way to take a deceptive philosophy of this world and spread it into our culture. And it would be incredibly naive, I think, to think that the rulers and authorities don't try to use methods like that to advance their agenda. And so we need to recognize it. We need to be on the defense against it by ourselves studying God's Word regularly so that we can recognize what is different from the truth. And then we can be armed with something to talk about with those around us. Conversation starters. Have you seen this movie? What did you think about that movie? It's just one of the examples we've looked at of how we can connect with our culture and unmask deception that is going on. So spiritual warfare, in other words, is much different maybe than what you initially may have thought coming into this class. I do believe can be encounters with spiritual forces. I've heard a few of you share some things with me. But for the most part, spiritual warfare is waged in this battle for the mind. Satan is blinding the minds of unbelievers, and that's where we are to engage, including to make sure we're not deceived by some of these lies. So last time we looked specifically at a few movies. We may talk about more tonight in our discussion time. I want to go over to the last page, Spiritual Warfare and Holidays. That may seem like the most bizarre subtitle in our course, so let me explain. We've already talked a little bit about holidays. We looked at, last time we looked at the passage in Exodus chapter 12. Exodus 12:26. I'll read it again. It says, "When your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you?" referring to the Passover evening ceremony, "then tell them it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians." So Passover was celebrated in large part as a teaching opportunity tool for children. And so there were traditions around it. It was to be done every year. There were certain things you had to do every year, and it would arouse curiosity and create this opportunity to teach children. We also saw in Deuteronomy chapter 6 that there is to be a continual talking about spiritual things with children as part of how we prepare them to face the world. And so there's good biblical support for having traditions and having a church or a calendar that reflects or helps us focus on spiritual things. Whether it is one of the biblical commanded feasts, of which there are a number in the Bible that are commanded for the Israelites to celebrate, or whether we create our own, from the time the Bible was written, we want to celebrate the great things God has done. We want to create opportunities to teach our children some of the things that have even happened since Old Testament times. Jesus' death and resurrection being front and center of that. And so we have typically celebrated Christmas, had some kind of, not always, not throughout church history. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight, but Christmas has been one of our main, at least in our lifetime, in our culture, has been a main tradition that it's not commanded in the New Testament that we celebrate Christmas. You know, Paul doesn't write, make sure you put your gifts out under the Christmas tree every December 25th. You know, there's nothing like that in the Bible, but we do want to think about the birth of Christ. We put up nativity scenes. We think about that, and it is a great time to talk with our children about why we celebrate Jesus coming into the world. And so Christmas can fit into that pattern of having a routine, having traditions, having a calendar, and a weekly and daily routine that that drive our thoughts towards God. It's helpful for us as adults. It's especially helpful for children. It's part of how we guard ourselves against the deception that is out there. It's part of how we prepare children for having a knowledge of the truth. And it's part of how we can engage our culture. Christmas is the only time of year, really, where you can go shopping and hear Christian music playing just about anywhere. It's not all Christian music, but you know, there'll be soundtracks in just about any store you go into that play songs that are explicitly Christian. It's the only time that happens. So it is an opportunity, a connection point that we can talk with others about Jesus. And so that's where I'm coming from with this topic headline, is that holidays can be a part of spiritual warfare. And we want to be intentional about that and make the most of those opportunities, just like with popular culture and just like when we talked about children's ministry. So with that being said, I want to dive into a little more of a specific topic with holidays. I do this not because it's a super important topic with spiritual warfare, but I just personally think it's really interesting and really well illustrates what I want to cover in how we can make the most of spiritual warfare and holidays. So I do have to put a disclaimer out. There are no children here tonight except my own, and they're going to be okay with this. But if you're watching online or you're watching a video later on, this may not be suitable for younger children. I just want to say that, and so you can preview it and then come back in just a moment if it's okay for your children to watch this. We're going to talk about Santa. Okay? So nothing too bad if you were thinking, "Whoa, what are we going to talk about?" But I do want to put that warning out that if there are any parents watching, later on or watching right now with children, that you may not want for them to watch this. So, where do we get our tradition about Santa Claus? How did that come about? Is it helpful or not helpful? What should we do with Santa? So that's the kind of question I want to talk about, because it is a very important part of most families' traditions, what we do every year. And I think, like anything else, this is the kind of thing that we should be open to considering what aspect of spiritual warfare could play into this. Could there be deception that is introduced through this, or is this okay? Can we change it a little bit so that it's more helpful, or do we just do it the way everyone around us is doing it? Those are the kind of questions I think that we really should be working through on any number of topics. And Santa, I think, is particularly interesting. It can have a really significant effect on children and their spiritual development. So one of the things you will hear a lot is that our churches or our Christian culture at this point in time does not really preach a biblical God as much as it should. That some churches are so adrift, or some people's view of God is so drifted from biblical revelation that it's more like people are worshiping some kind of Santa Claus in the sky than the God of the Bible. What I want to suggest tonight is it's actually in reverse. Santa Claus was created intentionally to model the God of the Bible, but to change it. In other words, it's not that Santa Claus came and then people started changing their theology to match Santa Claus. It was that the theology was already there that viewed God as some sort of Santa Claus, and Santa Claus was created to fit that theology. Now, all of what I'm going to say tonight is not to say that Santa is evil. I am not going to say that you can't do Santa in your home or with your kids. We kind of have a good time joking about Santa in our house. We've never banned Santa or anything like that. I will present or challenge maybe some of the ways that we do Santa, and that's up to you as a parent if you do Santa with your kids to think through, and we can come to different conclusions. But I do want to present a way of kind of thinking through that issue. So let me just back up a little bit and talk about where do we get the idea of Santa Claus from. I'm going to do it somewhat quickly, but the story starts, of course, with the real St. Nicholas. There was a real man who was named Nicholas, later named a saint of the Catholic Church. He lived in the 4th century, and he had legends develop about him over the next few centuries about how he was very generous, gave to children. Several miracles are associated with St. Nicholas that are very late in when they first appear, meaning centuries later after his lifetime. The historical St. Nicholas is perhaps best known for attending the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. He was a bishop, and there was a lot of heated debate between a number of the bishops and Arius, who was the sort of dissenting voice in the Council of Nicaea about the exact way of describing Jesus. And according to some historical records, St. Nicholas punched him in the face in the midst of one of these heated debates. So there's a lot of memes that'll go around in social media today kind of making fun of something about Santa Claus and punching a heretic or something like that. So if you ever see that and wonder where that's coming from, that's where it comes from. The Catholic Church officially made his day of celebration, or to honor him, December 6th. And so there are many cultures that have some kind of traditional celebration of him on December 6th. The idea of him coming Christmas Eve doesn't appear until much later. And I'm going to talk about kind of how that changed. Many countries in Europe still celebrate St. Nicholas on December 6th. And there were different traditions. There were some who believed that children could leave their boots out at night and he would put a treat in on the night of December 5th. And there would be something like that when they woke up on December 6th, they'd get something from St. Nicholas. Our modern Santa, by our I mean the American Santa, I think many of us have the idea that it sort of emerged over time, that people from Europe came over with some of their traditions, and we gradually sort of Americanized and created what is Santa today. That's actually not the history of Santa. Santa was not celebrated at all. St. Nicholas Day was not celebrated at all in our country throughout the 1700s, colonial America, even after America was born, even into the 1800s. If you were around in 1810 and asked someone, "Oh, is Santa going to see you this year?" no one would have any idea what you were talking about. So the Santa tradition started suddenly. It was started intentionally. It was created by a group of social elites in New York City, really beginning in 1810, but that sort of really came out in 1823. Between those years, there were a group of, they're called the Knickerbockers, if you're at all familiar with New York history. They were a group of people that really wanted to impact culture, create culture, and Christmas at this time was a pretty bad holiday. It was almost kind of like maybe you might think of Halloween. It was a night for staying out late, partying, getting drunk, crime occurring, that kind of thing. That was just how Christmas had been for years. In fact, Christmas was banned from being celebrated at all by some of the most religious Christians. I mean, the entire colony of Massachusetts banned any kind of celebration of Christmas all the way till 1850, just because they associated it with kind of wild partying. You know, today it's kind of reversed. If you're against Christmas, you must be an atheist or something like that. But it was the most religious Christians who were opposed to Christmas in the 1800s. But these Knickerbockers wanted to create tradition that would make Christmas more family-friendly, that would make Christmas something that would be more positive. And so they began to really talk up some myths about someone named St. Nicholas. They got the idea from stories they heard about what some Europeans had done in the past, but it wasn't like they just developed a tradition that was already here. They intentionally made the choice to create this tradition. And there were several involved, including Washington Irving, who wrote Rip Van Winkle and many other classics. He was one of the three sort of main Knickerbockers that would talk about St. Nicholas and talk about, how can we make this into a tradition. But there was one person in particular, Clement Moore, who took these ideas and was inspired to write a poem. It was published in 1823. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. That poem was not let me take all our ideas about Santa Claus and put them into a nice poem. That poem was what created the whole Santa Claus story. No one had ever really heard of Santa Claus up until the time this poem was published. So, the question I have is, what was the theology of these men? What was their intention? What are they trying to do? I think that would be helpful for us to know, just like we might analyze any movie like this. And one of the things that I found that I think is very interesting is you can compare "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" with an earlier poem. And when you compare this with an earlier poem, you can see that there's obviously some connection, that the form of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" is inspired by an earlier poem. The earlier poem was actually written in 1662. I would be shocked if any of you have ever heard of it. No one has ever heard of it today. But in 1823, it was more well-known. This was a poem that people read and heard, especially well-educated people like the Knickerbockers in New York. So this poem was by Michael Wigglesworth. I just want to read a couple lines so you can see some of the connections. But the title of this poem is "Day of Doom." In other words, the 1662 poem is about Judgment Day, when Christ comes to judge the living and the dead. And the opening of his poem is, "Still was the night, serene and bright, when all men sleeping lay." Think about, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. It seems like it's just kind of a cuter way of saying the same thing. Another line from the older poem about Judgment Day was, "Soul, take thine ease, let sorrow cease, much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among, the evening before." So he's talking about the evening before Judgment Day, how relaxed everyone was, how unconcerned about what was going to happen the next day was, how they were all at ease. Clement Moore's poem starts, "'Twas the night before Christmas." Another line is, "Before his face," this is again about Judgment Day, "'before his face the heavens gave place, and skies are rent asunder, with mighty voice and hideous noise, more terrible than thunder. His brightness damps heaven's glorious lamps, and makes them hide their heads. As if afraid and quite dismayed, they quit their wonted steads." Clement Moore's poem, "When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below. When what to my wondering eyes did appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer." All right, both are talking about light coming. Both are talking about the skies sort of coming apart with noise. One is obviously a lot more kid-friendly and happy. The other is talking about Christ coming in judgment. So I just read that to point out that this sort of origin of the Santa myth is intentionally taking a popular depiction of Christ coming in judgment and turning it into this jolly elf coming to bring presents for kids. But it copies a lot of the same forms and patterns. That doesn't mean that it's evil or anything like that, but I just want you to begin to see the connection. Now these were not the only people that had their hand on creating the Santa myth, but it is where you first see reindeer. It is where you first see Santa having sort of a magical ability to go down chimneys. Going down the chimney is created by 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. It's going to be Thomas Nast, who later on in the 1800s adds a lot more to the story. Thomas Nast was a famous political cartoonist. He's the one who created the donkey and elephant for our Democrats and Republicans in his political cartoons. But he also drew a lot of cartoons about Santa Claus. And it's Thomas Nast who created the idea of elves assisting Santa, who created the idea of Santa living at the North Pole, who created the idea of children writing letters to Santa. All of this is coming in around the 1870s and 80s is when he's adding these different items to the story. But with what purpose and what theology? Ultimately, where Santa has landed is he's someone who is very much like God. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He has supernatural abilities. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. All right? And what kind of God is he? Well, he rewards those who are good, and he punishes those who are bad. He very much fits with the liberal Protestant view of Jesus. The liberal Protestant view of Jesus is essentially Jesus was a great person. It can even acknowledge that Jesus is God, that he did miracles. But liberal Protestants typically minimize or deny the atonement. Jesus' death on the cross is in some way a good example for us, but it doesn't actually save us or do something for us. Liberal Protestants can go so far, if you're almost kind of on the deist end, to even deny the resurrection. And liberal Protestants will say salvation is basically by being a good person. You aren't saved, as we say, evangelical. What defines an evangelical belief is that salvation is by grace. You put your faith in Jesus. He gives you salvation. And we know as evangelicals, we're kind of always fighting against popular opinion, which is, well, I'm a pretty good person, so I should go to heaven. And that's not the biblical message, but that is very popular even in churches if you're of the more liberal bent. And very much all the people that I'm talking about that have their role in creating the Santa myth come from the liberal Protestant tradition. There's a lot to admire about it. There's a lot of great Americans who've done great things for our country who come from that tradition. Many presidents have come from that tradition. But it is not, or does not usually have a sharp view of the gospel, that we need God's grace. We need Jesus' death and resurrection in order for us to be saved. It is more of a merit-based system. And so, as you bring Santa Claus into your home, I just want to put out the idea of thinking about what it is that you're doing. Is it worthwhile or not? And I would just say that the common, most extreme form is that we do everything we can to convince our kids that Santa is real. I like to talk about Santa with apologetics as well, because it's, from a child's perspective, they have every reason to believe Santa's real, right? That their parents tell them there's a Santa. Their parents are right about all kinds of other things, so there must be a Santa. The cookies disappear at night. There's presents suddenly appearing under the tree. There's a story Cheryl's told me about her brothers, that Cheryl has two much older brothers, so she was too young to actually remember this, but she's heard the story that one Christmas morning her brothers are opening all the presents Christmas morning, and they said, there must be a Santa Claus because Mom and Dad would never get us all this stuff. So that's evidence that validates. I mean, they hear the story, then here's the evidence before them that, yeah, Santa Claus is real. And the weatherman on TV is talking about where is Santa. so you have all this verification. You have all kind of, what reason would you have to not believe in Santa? And for many kids, it's very real. And then all of a sudden, no, there is no Santa. At different ages, depending on whatever age it is that you put it together. I have to wonder. I'm not able to know this to the full extent, but I have to wonder if kind of our skeptical mind, the reason why so many, especially college students, are saying, how do I know there's a God? I need really good proof before I'm going to believe there's a God. Some of that skepticism may be born from that firmly believing that there is a Santa who knows everything about them, who's coming to bring them presents, and then finding out that, oh, actually, no, it's not true. There's some other explanation for all of it. So I would just be careful with that. I think it's fine to tell kids about Santa. I urge to be careful about going to extremes to really make sure your child still fully believes in Santa Claus when they're 13 years old or whatever it may be. Because, it's just, what is the benefit of it, is the question I bring up. So our kids have known that there isn't really a Santa Claus from the beginning, but we talk about Santa, joke about Santa. There's movies even, we talked about movies last week. Movies about Santa often have some very interesting theology. We watch the movie Elf every year in our house. It's full of theology. I think I've done a blog before and just all the, even to the point of Buddy the Elf prepares all these Christmas decorations in the mall, in the shopping store, because Santa's coming the next day. And so he's got just all these incredible decorations he puts up all night. And there's a lot of comparison to be made between that and preparing the temple for when God's presence comes and fills the temple. He's preparing this sort of temple for Santa to come. That's just one example, but there's a lot there. And it shouldn't be surprising that Santa movies have a lot of connections with biblical theology, because Santa himself was created off of the biblical concept of God. It just leaves out some things, right? Santa isn't making payment for the boys that are naughty so that they can all get presents. There's no part of that in, the atonement is absent from the Santa story. So I just put that forward as, you don't have to do a tradition just because it's how you grew up when you're a kid. I think that's the number one reason we do it, is because, I remember hearing about Santa when I was a kid, so I should do that for my kids. We don't have to do that. We can create our own family traditions. We can think through, hey, yeah, we'll do Santa, but I won't maybe do this part of it or that part of it. We need to kind of think through how we're using our traditions to the maximum that we can to help our children grow spiritually. And I'll just leave it at that. Again, maybe you say, no, we love Santa, I'm going to do Santa. That's fine. I just want to kind of bring forth that we can think through some of these kinds of issues, how they might affect us, impact us. And so if you have questions online, questions here, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Or you can message me. Be happy to talk about that some more. The last line on your notes is spiritual warfare and church ministry. I want to talk about that briefly because I've already taught on it some, but I want to give a kind of final reminder. Anything you do in church, greeting, sound, children's ministry, Sunday school, music, deacons, any kind of outreach team, men's ministry, anything that you're doing in ministry to advance what our church is doing is, in a way, spiritual warfare, and we should view it that way. Because it's all tied to us coming together as a team with different gifts, with different callings, to do what we can to get the gospel message out there. And people can't come in and hear the gospel in this setting that we have if there's no buildings and grounds team and committee. Fixing our sign so that more people know when our service times are and when we can meet, when they can come and hear service. greeters play that essential role in helping people feel welcome so that they are much more likely to return. It's all about getting the gospel message out there, overcoming the deception, the blinding of the minds of unbelievers that Satan is about. And so I just want to encourage you, I hope, whatever role you have, it's an important role. It's all necessary to get done for our church to be able to do what it does, and it is a big part of spiritual warfare. So with that, we will conclude our series on spiritual warfare. And again, if you've been watching online, I thank you. Feel free to message me anytime if you have any questions. I'm going to have some discussion time now with the folks that are here in person.